Should Trump's classified document case go to trial, do you think, before November?
I think all of the cases should be dealt with before November. We need to know what's going to happen before the presidency happens, because after that, should he become president, I don't think any of it's going to get heard.
Well, that was something. Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. It seems like you have to be actively running for president against Donald Trump to be a Republican official willing to tell the truth and publicly call on upholding the rule of law as part and parcel to a fair election in the United States of America. That was Nikki Haley putting plainly and simply what 2/3 of all Americans believe today as we convene here, including 38% of all Republicans in this country. They agree that verdicts in those criminal trials against Donald Trump should be reached before voters go to the ballot box in November. It's a reality that is appearing to slip out of reach a little bit with each passing day this week. Now, the Supreme Court's ruling that it will hear Trump's presidential immunity claim almost puts a nail in the coffin of that being possible in both those federal trials. As Nikki Haley touches on there are two massive consequences of that, of the Trump trials being delayed until after the presidential election. One of them is that the voters are not going to have all the facts as a jury of Trump's peers would adjudicate them or render them before they have to cast their own ballots in November. And voters deserve to know that if one of the two choices on the president menu is a convicted felon. And second, if the trials are pushed back and Trump should prevail in the November election, they never happen. Trump would then most likely use the tools of the presidency to shut down the cases that he, on the stump, publicly smears as political prosecutions. And that means the American people would never see the evidence that would be put before the jury in those trials. They would never have an answer on whether Trump is criminally liable. So this lack of accountability we're witnessing and we now risk in the courts goes hand in hand with Donald Trump's goal for running for office again, as well as his goal in terms of what he would do once he got there with the rule of law, and that is to model his policies around what an autocrat would do. He wants an autocrat's justice system, one that enables him and does not act as a check on his power in any way, one he can weaponize to target and pursue his enemies, not just shield his friends. What we saw from the nation's highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, this week, actually inches him further toward achieving the goal on both parts, shielding himself and using it as a weapon. This ruling could end up being, either wittingly or unwittingly, a major step forward for Trump and for the nation's slow walk toward American autocracy. It's where we begin the hour with criminal defense attorney Burke. He helped lead both efforts for House Democrats in the impeachments of Donald J. Trump. Hi.
Hey, Nicole. It's great to be here.
Is this too bleak or blunt of an assessment?
Listen, I think everything with the former president is bleak, but I think you have to look at it wide-eyed, right? As a trial lawyer in my day job who tries a lot of cases, we sometimes refer to legal terrorists. Right, those are people who aren't interested in following the rules and having issues decided on the merits. Donald Trump's whole strategy is delay, delay, delay. And legal terrorists who are trying to avoid the merits can at times get away with it, at times. I would say, though, you know, for all those folks who said he should be held accountable, including Senate Republicans, there are all these cases out there, and you would think that someone running for president would want to have an opportunity to address charges that they tried to prevent the peaceful transfer, someone innocent. And so the question is, seeing what's going on, I do think there's an opportunity for trials. I do think the Supreme Court can rule in this term, and there could be a trial in D.C. on the most important case, right? If a president seeks to use his power and use the position to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power, there could not be a more important case. And I see why the American people want to see it. But I also think people shouldn't just stand on the sidelines saying, oh, I hope that trial happens. Yeah. All those facts, again, should be used in every way possible, including his refusal to address it in court.
Help me understand what happened this week. This didn't seem to be a decision where the law was in question. Why do you think the Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments in an argument that basically amounts to I'm a king?
You know, it's complicated, and you wish the Supreme Court would have simply said, denied cert, go ahead, we can consider it later. Nobody is above the law. You don't get an early preview. Now, interestingly, the special counsel had sought the Supreme Court's early involvement, and they turned him down. They said, no, have the Court of Appeals rule first. So it gave him some cover to say, well, both sides had asked, so we're going to do it. You also ask, why did they have such a elongated schedule, right? They could have done it more quickly. But they did what they did, and we can't change that. And again, one of the things that an authoritarian leader does is he or she weakens all the institutions around them, whether it's another branch like the Senate or whether it's the judiciary. And we're seeing some effects of that right now. But I think if people should still hold out hope and encourage and put pressure publicly for there to be a trial after the ruling by the Supreme Court.
Let me just play the devil's advocate, because I've sat in this chair and I've told people, viewers, to have hope that Robert Mueller would get to the bottom of the question about whether there was coordination or shared mission between Russia and the Trump campaign. And then with one fell swoop, Bill Barr went out and said, free and clear. Trump declared himself exonerated, and 23 months of legal efforts to do what you just described down the drain. And then the two impeachments, where truly the facts weren't really in question. I mean, you had Republican insiders as fact witnesses not disputing anything that the Democrats were alleging. And in both instances, for political purposes, Trump was acquitted by Senate Republicans. And then you had a crime committed really on TV with people watching on January 6th. With our own eyes, we could see Trump supporters beating and hurting law enforcement officials with the goal of overturning an election he lost. Phone calls with Fred Raffensperger, and we're told, well, you know, the calendar's going to be tight. It's possible, you know, Chuck could shorten this and the court could go faster than they've ever gone in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Maybe it'll be okay. Why does it keep coming up short for the public and a win for Donald Trump?
Nicolle, I love your devil's advocacy, and you're so good at it. I'm going to push back, though.
Please.
So, and you're pushing my buttons, I have to say. I was there for the first investigation of the Russia obstruction. I was there for the first impeachment based on Ukraine, which we now know how important it was. And you can say this. The Senate did not have the courage to carry out their duties, right? The founding fathers imagined a president like former President Trump who had violated his oath. They didn't imagine senators of the same party who would do the same.
Right.
But I will tell you this. What those hearings in the first impeachment did in investigation is they amplified. They showed his conduct. They showed his violation of the rules. They showed what he did. And the American people spoke. They spoke in 2020 and voted him out, and they had evidence. Now, we don't know the final story on January 6th. We had a full impeachment where we made sure people couldn't say they're tourists. We put it all out there. And interestingly, 7 Republican senators showed courage.
Right.
And there were many more who said, we proved the former president violated his oath, but they let him off the hook because he was a former. Some, like, you know, at the time, Speaker McConnell said that there's a criminal process to try to deal with it.
Referred him to Merrick Garland, yeah.
And then what you've seen, though, is such a profile of lack of courage, right?
Yeah.
They now are succumbing to the power pressures of politics, all except some people who are courageous, like Liz Cheney.
Right.
But again, the events of January 6th were shown in that impeachment. They were shown by the great work of the January 6th committee. The American people saw it. People should be talking about it. They should be talking about Donald Trump not wanting to be held accountable. And again, he is in this delay schedule. The courts will not save us. You're talking to somebody who in the first investigation waited 2 years for enforcement of a subpoena in the obstruction.
Right.
So the court process has some problems at times in dealing with another branch of government or someone who is in that branch who violated the oath. But I think you should say this entire process, including the criminal cases, including Donald Trump refusing to publicly say, I want a trial because I want the American people to see what happened before the election, that can all help the American people do the right thing. Say, we are judge and jury of this person. We are going to make sure he's not president again, in which case all these trials can happen after. So, yes, I understand why people are discouraged because some of these things should not have happened in our judicial system. But I think you have to see that the American people can still see all this, and you should still amplify these charges. I think some people see his most ardent supporters become more fervent in their support of him when these cases happen. But they forget that who we're really talking about are not the very strong advocates or opponents. It's everybody in the middle, the folks in the Midwest, the folks all over who may have voted Republican a lot or are independents, but are concerned about what they're hearing. They don't necessarily show up in the polls, but those are the people who will decide the election. So my hope is, while the courts are doing what they're doing, that everybody takes these allegations, takes the facts of what are happening, takes his refusal to be heard in court and state his defense and have it judged by a judge and jury, use that as evidence why he's unfit to be president, why it's not only a test of him, but our entire institutions. So I hear you, but I do think this process has been helpful. I think the criminal charges has amplified how anybody else would be charged with a crime. No one is above the law. And while it is discouraging and disappointing that the trials are been delayed, the hope is that we'll have other effect by helping to show he's treated no different than anyone else. And the American people should see that he engaged in alleged crimes for which the evidence is overwhelming, and make a decision whether he's fit for any position, let alone to be president of the United States.